Hi there. We're back with another episode of Pursuing the Prize. We're still considering what pertains to the kingdom of God, and we are still in our subtopic, and this is the final entry in this subtopic, of the subjects of the kingdom. So for the past few weeks, we've been considering the type of lives that those who are in the kingdom of Jesus Christ, what type of lives they live. How did they carry themselves in this world? How would you know they belong to Jesus? And what does that, if we are members of the kingdom, what does that call us to do in response? So as part of this conversation, of course, we've talked about things like love, we talked about peace, but we want to turn our attention to a final topic here that I believe is quite important for all of the topics that we've covered, and that is sincerity. So the heading that we have here is that we want to demonstrate sincerity to all. But what does that mean and how is that done? That's what we want to consider in this discussion today. But I think it goes without saying that for many people who are on the outside of the kingdom and looking into it, that they really believe that many Christians are just hypocrites. I have heard this accusation made. I'm sure that you have as well. Perhaps you yourself have at one time made that accusation of Christians. And while there is some merit to it, we must say that many times that arises from ignorance and spite. It really has nothing to do with specific things that are actually hypocritical or that are proven hypocrisy, but rather it arises from somebody who just has a bone to pick with the church or with someone in the church. And so it's easy for them to make the excuse that everyone in the church is nothing but a hypocrite, and that is what keeps them away then from the church. But that is not really a proper answer for one thing, and again, it doesn't come from the right place. But again, I must make it clear that sometimes there is merit to that idea. There are people in the church who are hypocritical. They do say one thing and live a different way. They expect from others things they would never do themselves. So we find that hypocrisy is a real problem in the kingdom. It should not be, but it certainly is if we're being realistic about the situation. But one thing we need to understand about this is that accusation, no matter how true or false it may be, we must realize that Jesus taught against hypocrisy in his life. If there is a Christian out there that is living a hypocritical life, he's doing so in contrast to what Jesus teaches him to do. So we see that he's not in compliance with Jesus' requirements for those who call upon his name. That's going to take us over to Matthew 23 to get us started here in the scriptures. And I want us to really think about what Jesus says here in Matthew chapter 23 and these first 12 verses of this chapter. Because Jesus highlights a big problem with hypocrisy, or really several problems with hypocrisy. But he also makes it clear that this is not something that ought to define the people of God. So please join me in this reading of Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 12, and let's hear what Jesus has to say about hypocrisy and the problems that are associated with it. He says, beginning in verse 1, Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say, and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you, do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Did you spot some of the problems that Jesus highlights about hypocrisy and why it is so dangerous? I do want to make one note here that this is not the only time Jesus condemns hypocrisy, especially among religious leaders. In fact, I would recommend that you take a look at Matthew chapter 16, and you'll see there Jesus telling his disciples directly to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, which is hypocrisy. But regardless, we find Jesus here has had enough. This is the last straw. And he goes on full assault against hypocrisy and those who practice it, namely among the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders. But he really highlights the issues here to his disciples so they understand why this is so bad and why they should avoid this at all costs. In the first two verses there, the first three verses actually, he notes that the Pharisees and the scribes sit in Moses' seat. What he's saying there is that the Pharisees and the scribes interpreted the law for the people by and large. They lived in a society where people were not very literate. They relied upon others telling them this information. So they sat in Moses' seat in the sense that they were teachers. They imparted information. They were telling others what the law of God had to say. And so Jesus says in verse 3, as a result of that, if they tell you to do something, you should do it. But do not do according to their works, or maybe think of that as do not do according to their example. But why? Because they say and they do not do. That is at the heart of hypocrisy. Really, that is a great definition of hypocrisy right there, that very brief phrase, for they say and do not do. Hypocrisy is saying something, but not actually doing it. Of having your thoughts in one area and your expression in one area, and then your actions in a completely different place. That is at the core of hypocrisy through and through. But it does not stop there. He notes in verse 4, they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. That is the natural outcome of hypocrisy, expecting of others what you will not do yourself. He notes in verses 5 through 10, really through verse 12, because he's talking about the same topic there, that hypocrites tend to look for honor for themselves. They look for advantage for themselves. He says how the Pharisees and the religious leaders in general, look at what they do in verse 5. All their works they do to be seen by men. They want people to applaud them. They want to be noticed. They make their phylacteries broad, the things that they would bind on their forearms. They want to make those broader so people think of them as more holy and more righteous. They enlarge the borders of their garments, again, for the same reason, to make themselves look more spiritually oriented. They love the best places at feasts. They want to be in a place of honor they have not deserved. Same with the best seats in the synagogues. They have not deserved that, but they want to take it for themselves. They want to be called by certain titles and certain names. They want to be greeted in the marketplace. All of this they do because they want to draw attention to self. So again, we find one major characteristic of hypocrisy is what Jesus mentions there in verse 3, saying and not doing. But then we also note that hypocrisy also involves a great deal of arrogant pride. So in many respects, we find that hypocrisy is itself a manifestation of human pride. And for that reason, we can understand why it is so dangerous and why it must be rejected. Because notice what Jesus says when he concludes there in verses 11 through 12. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Greatness in the kingdom of Christ is not about the best seat at the synagogue, or the best seat at the feast, or whatever fancy title you ascribe for yourself. Greatness in the kingdom is about service. Jesus talks about that in other places, but here he just mentions it simply that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. That is what true greatness means, not hypocrisy. But then in verse 12 he notes there that whoever exalts himself is going to be humbled, and hypocrisy exalts itself. Hypocrisy lifts people up, it lifts their hearts up, it makes them think things about themselves that are not true. But we find that true greatness is found in humility, because he who humbles himself will be exalted. Because if God is the one doing the exalting, then you are not taking honor for yourself, because you're focused on what others need rather than what you yourself need or what you yourself want. So again, hypocrisy has two major dangers then. Again, it is the idea of saying and not doing, but it is also the idea of seeking for yourself that which you do not deserve, honor that does not belong to you, in other words. And that was the problem the Pharisees and the Sadducees had and all the religious leaders in Jesus' time, where they were about themselves and not about the people. So Jesus then expects his people to be sincere. He tells his disciples to make sure they do according to what they are told, what they are taught from the Word of God, but just do not follow after the example of those saying it if the example be hypocritical. He wants sincerity from his people. He wants them to show genuineness in every facet of life. But the question goes back to how is that shown? What are the specific ways that can be demonstrated? Let's turn our attention to that thought now as we dig a little bit deeper and understand more about sincerity and why sincerity is the path that Christians take when they're members of the kingdom of Christ. So we find here this statement: sincerity brings the heart and the hand together. Well, what do I mean by that? We're talking about our motives, the reason why we do what we do, and then actually the actions themselves. So we're taking our motives, and we're taking our actions, and we're making them both right. So the actions that we take are not just right with a wrong heart, and nor do we have a right heart with the wrong actions. We are making sure that both are in alignment, that they are both correct before God. We're not speaking of precision obedience here. That's a phrase that I've heard thrown around recently in conversations like this, so we're not really talking about that. But we're just saying that as a general rule, the things that we do are the right things, and we do those things because we know they're right and they're arising from proper motivations. We're not looking to gain honor for ourselves like the Pharisees and Sadducees were. We're not looking to exalt ourselves like the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. We're looking instead to humble ourselves through service, because we know that that's the right thing to do. So again, we're not self-seeking. We're not looking to gain advantage. We're doing the right things because we know they're right and we are convicted to that end. That's going to take us over to 1 Timothy chapter 1. So in 1 Timothy chapter 1, and verse 5 specifically, we find that Paul here is speaking of love. And he's talking about the purpose of the commandment. But let's just go ahead and read 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5 and try to understand what Paul is saying here and how it applies to our conversation about sincerity. Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. So we're finding here in the very beginning of 1 Timothy, where Timothy is in Ephesus dealing with some difficult situations that have come up. People are teaching a variety of doctrines that are false, that are not according to the truth of God. And here Timothy is in the midst of this, and he has to be able to correct those false teachers to get them back on track. But he says here in verse 5, the purpose of the commandment. What commandment is he talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament law in general. Because if you go down, he's saying there in verses 8 through 9 that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. So he's referring really to the same thing in verse 5 when he says the commandment, just using that phrase as a general reference to the law itself. But what is the purpose of the law of God that he gave to Moses all those years ago? What did he intend when he gave that law? Well, love was the purpose of it. In fact, if you recall from the teaching of Jesus, he would say on many occasions that love is the main purpose of the law and the prophets. That is really what binds all of it together is love. But love that is proper. And that's what Paul's addressing here. It's not just love, and then there's nothing else tethered to it. There's something specific about love. The purpose of the commandment, the purpose of those Old Testament teachings that we have, that we still learn from to this day, that purpose is love, but from a pure heart, from a good conscience, from sincere faith. And when we're properly taught, that is a type of love that we will have in our hearts. It's not just love that benefits self, because frankly, love is not intended always to benefit self. It's meant to benefit others. But when we have that understanding, we realize that it must come from that pure heart, a heart that is not looking for advantage, that is not looking for things that are improper, that is not looking at things through a human lens, but is rather looking at them through the lens of purity and cleanliness in God's sight, a good conscience, being able to determine between what is right and wrong with the showing of that love, and then sincere faith. Faith that is through and through true. Faith that is in no wise something that is teetering on questionable, where we're really not sure whether we're coming or we're going. It is genuine, sincere faith. And Paul would actually talk to Timothy about this in the first chapter of his second letter to Timothy, and refer to the faith that Timothy himself had, but also that the faith his mother had and his grandmother had, and refers to it all as a genuine, unhypocritical faith. Saying there that they all have a faith within them that is true to the core. There's nothing false within it. It really is the right type of faith. But again, going back to Paul's point here in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he's making it very clear that when Christians are sincere, it is shown in the love that they have for others. It arises from the proper motivations. It is shown in the way they treat others and the way they think about others and the faith they show toward God even. All of that love is sincere through and through in all the different areas that Paul highlights. And as he goes on in verses 6 through 7, he talks there about those who have turned aside from this, who have abandoned that type of love, who have forgotten what the purpose of the commandment is. And they are not showing a pure heart, they're not showing a good conscience, and they're not showing sincere faith. So we want to be those, if we are in the kingdom of Christ, who show genuine love, sincere love, love that comes from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. But the other part of this conversation as well we should consider is the fact that wisdom is another manifestation of a lack of hypocrisy or sincerity. So here's what James chapter 3 and verse 17 has to say when we consider this thought about sincerity and how wisdom comes into play with it. So let's read together James chapter 3 and verse 17. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. I'll go ahead and read verse 18 as well. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. James in this context has been talking about wisdom and the two types of wisdom that are available to us. There's the wisdom of the world that leads to envy and strife and all kinds of problems, or there's the wisdom that is from above, or you might want to think of that as the wisdom that is from God. And how does James say that wisdom behaves itself or acts, and how do people see it? It shows itself first in purity, in peace, gentleness, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, and without hypocrisy. So godly wisdom leads people to sincerity. So we've seen that one manifestation of the sincerity that Christ's people have in his kingdom is love, but we also see it shown in the wisdom that they demonstrate before others as well. Again, they're able to demonstrate they have a sincere heart in all that they say, all that they do, and all that they think. And notice that in this particular context, the reason James brings this up is because there seems to have been some conflicts taking place among his people that were reading this letter. And he's saying to them here, this is the pathway to have peace and to resolve these conflicts is godly wisdom. Wisdom that is pure, that is peaceful, that is gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, that is not partial, not showing personal favoritism, and that is not hypocritical, that is through and through sincere. So your motives are right, your actions are right, and those two together are what make for peace. That's exactly what verse 18 is teaching there. That is the way to resolve conflict. That is the way to make for peace with other people. So again, these are very visible activities that are taking place, that sincerity is demonstrating and helping and enabling to take place. So it starts with love, yes. Love must be unhypocritical. It must be sincere. It cannot be shown just to gain advantage over others. But then wisdom must be the same way as well. And when we have that type of love and that type of wisdom, and we bring those two things together along with many other items in Scripture that are discussed as being sincere, we are able to show others where our loyalties truly lie. They don't have to think of us and say, I'm not really sure what their motives are. I'm not sure if they're looking at this for their own advantage or they're looking at it for my advantage. People should never think that when they're considering those who are in the kingdom of Christ. It should always be, I know where this person stands, and I know that they're looking for my benefit according to the teachings of the Scriptures. Now, that can be a hard balance. We cannot control the perception of others, especially if they want to see things negatively, and that's not what we're suggesting. But as much as within our power, we need to do our best to show love that is defined the way that Paul defines it, that is from a pure heart, that is from a good conscience, that is from sincere faith. But we also need the type of wisdom of which James speaks. And we need to share that type of wisdom to the point that people can see that we're not partial, we're not hypocritical, we have a balanced perspective on life and on who we are and who they are. And we're not looking at things through one slanted lens or another. We're very careful at all times to maintain that sincerity, that impartiality, that unhypocritical perspective and way of living. And people should never look at us and think, when we have these things, that we're no different than the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the scribes or anyone else that Jesus condemned back there in Matthew chapter 23. They should always see that sincerity oozing out of us, and that will have some drawing power to it. Obviously, Jesus has all the drawing power. It's not about us per se. But that is to say that we, if we are members of Christ's kingdom, have a great responsibility on our shoulders to be sincere in all that we do, and to not bring shame on the church, and to not bring shame on our Lord Jesus through hypocrisy. Because we know that's against his will, and we know that is not what he intends for us to be, and that we do not want to show that through our love or our wisdom. We want to instead show sincerity in all matters. So I'd invite you, if you are a member of Christ's kingdom, to really give thought to whether or not you are sincere, whether or not the things that you do are motivated by the right things, or if perhaps there are some other motivations that are behind the scenes that are more for your own advantage. And if you're not a member of Christ's kingdom, then I would urge you to really consider what the Bible has to say about sincerity and a lack of hypocrisy, and why it is so evil before God, and why it must be purged from our hearts. And I would hope that you would marvel and be impressed by the teaching of Jesus to this effect, knowing that Jesus himself was not a hypocrite, and he taught strongly against hypocrisy. I've heard many in the past refer to Jesus' teachings on this matter as some of his strongest, where they would say that there was nothing that made Jesus angrier than hypocrisy. And I believe that there is some truth to that in the Gospels. So I'd urge you to think about that as well and really give thought to the fact that Jesus was that type of person and the fact that he wants his people to be sincere as well, and that you would consider further how that applies to you and what you should do in response to that. So I hope that you've enjoyed our conversation about sincerity today. I hope it has encouraged you in some respect, and that you have learned something about what it means to be sincere and how Christ has this expectation of his people. We'll pick up next week with a new topic, or a new subtopic, I should say, but we'll continue talking about the kingdom and all that it means to us today. As always, again, we thank you for your time and your attention, and we hope that you have learned something from this. Thank you.